Welcome to Translating the Language of the Body, Somatic Ritual as Revision. Before we begin, I want to provide a brief content note. There will be brief mentions of post-traumatic stress disorder, postpartum depression, and institutional and intimate forms of abuse. I want to start by defining the term somatic ritual and where that entered my own creative practice. The word soma means of the body. So a somatic ritual is one that engages the full body, as opposed to a ritual that's more focused on interiority and the workings of the mind. I was first introduced to this term, somatic ritual, through the poet C.A. Conrad. And if you're interested in learning more about their somatic rituals, I highly recommend reading more of their work, where they go into more detail about the somatic rituals they've developed and how those rituals lead to the composition of their poems. And to give a more in-depth description of how a somatic ritual might manifest and how it can open doorways into creativity, I want to read a very brief essay by Ingrid Rojas Contreras. And in this essay, there will be mentions of PTSD. And this essay was sent to me by my mentor, Perrin Kearns, and I feel that it really embodies how a somatic ritual can be used towards a creative practice that grounds the body in the present moment, and in doing so, opens up our imaginations and sense of creativity. So Contreras writes, "One thing I knew as an aspiring writer was that I was supposed to sit in front of a page for more than 10 minutes. I could not. I had grown up in Colombia during a violent time in the country's history. My family and I had fled, but I suffered from PTSD. Fear had worked its way under my skin. I wrote a sentence, then questioned whether my surroundings were safe. I got up to check the locks, turn every available light on. The writing came a sentence at a time, but I could barely finish anything. Even so, I loved writing and longed to do it in spite of personal distress. First, I tried imagining myself as a cranky office manager. I monitored data. I clocked in and out with time cards. I created pie charts to track my time, and the time it took to track my time. I drew elaborate graphs where Y measured the rise and fall of quality pages, and X stood for possible culprits, starches, desk locations, prying eyes, news consumption, anxiety. The data did not bring me closer to the state of mind I had identified as the most conducive for writing. A floating between presence and absence, a sense of stillness, awareness, and listening. Reflecting on that ideal mental state, I thought of mesmerism, the precursor to hypnosis, conceived in the 1770s by the German physician Franz Anton Mesmer. One school of his followers favored the somnambulistic trance, instigated by a choreography of visuals and touch. I began to wonder whether such trances could be of use to me, whether they would induce that floating sensation I needed in order to quiet the disturbances of trauma and dedicate myself to writing. And so I began to develop a ritual, a way of hypnotizing myself. This love of ritual has metastasized into a way of life. There is an order to the cups I pull from the kitchen cupboard, a sameness to how I daily prepare what I ingest. 5 steps to my morning skincare routine, 4 steps at night. Once, upon finishing the work of knitting a 6-foot blanket, I immediately unspooled it, then reknit the thing. It began with a color, a muted ultramarine blue that is warmer than navy and bright like royal blue. I found it while scanning the racks for a slip in a hue I did not much wear, one I intended to wear exclusively for writing. Each day, in preparation for my work, I put on the slip and actively imagined for 10 minutes that the color was a place in which intrusive thoughts might not enter. Then I forced myself to sit and write. When I wore the slip, I felt overtaken on a cellular level by a serene form of concentration. Under the spell of chromatic conditioning, I began to accumulate pages and finish my projects. Over the 13 years I've dedicated myself to the somnambulistic trance, I've collected a number of outfits: silk slips, slinky tops, linen shorts, acrylic sweaters, all in muted ultramarine. At this point, I can no more resist wearing the color and sitting down to write than I can keep myself from taking a breath after an exhale. This mesmerism quiets my mind via an onslaught of repetition. The longer the repetition goes on, the stronger its mesmeric force. My ritual for self-mesmerism has grown more elaborate over the years. On my designated writing days, I plod to the closet and pick out something in that muted ultramarine, after which I pick a song to play on repeat. It will loop for the next hour, or sometimes the rest of the day. There is always an initial moment of claustrophobia, but the looping music encourages a trance. The operational chatter of my mind grows quiet before it grinds to a halt. I transition into the territory of concentration. I don't have to think about what I will do next. After doing it thousands of times, I've turned writing into muscle memory. The best music for self-mesmerism is the kind that embraces repeating and minimally evolving phrases. Callie Malone, Caterina Barbieri, Ben Vida, and William Basinski are artists I turn to with frequency. They are demanding, beautiful, blisteringly austere. Past the initial weariness of sonic repetition, I experience self-dissolution. I stop hearing the song. It becomes a series of staticky sonic impressions. At a glance, repetition may look like invariability, but repeated listenings of a song are never identical. Differences emerge out of the drone of a routinized task. A glass may slip. The water I splash myself with may be colder or hotter than I expect. I knit the stitches of my blanket tightly, then loose. The sameness of repetition is never the point. It is a daily door I step through, on the other side of which I am emptied and am filled with something better. I leave the familiar behind to embrace what is unfamiliar and mysterious. No matter what is happening in my life, choosing repetition lets me deliver myself to the moment at hand. Before self-mesmerism, trauma was something that exiled me from the present, causing me to revisit horrific events. It eroded my perception until I came to believe that long-gone dangers were extant in the middle of my peaceful everyday. Repetition is how I shed skins of anxiety. The highest abundance I know comes from stripping myself to the minimum. There I am boundless, timeless and surprising, a magnificent condensation of life. And I absolutely love this short essay by Contreras. I think it really reflects very deeply the way that ritual becomes a way of reconnecting with your body, a way of learning to listen to what your body is telling you, and a way of remaining connected and grounded to the present moment, which, in my own experience, is the best space in which to create. And with somatic ritual, by engaging with these types of sensory conduits, which for Contreras is this muted ultramarine color, the chromatic conditioning of wearing that every day before writing, and then the sonic repetition of playing a song on repeat. These methods of sensory grounding are a way to not only help us listen to our bodies, but reinvigorate our associative thought. And that's what we use to make connections. That's how our creativity blossoms. And in my own creative practice, it looks a little bit different than Contreras or C.A. Conrad. For me, a lot of my rituals revolve around the patterns of my everyday, of living with chronic illness. But I did want to go a little deeper into the backstory of how I developed these rituals before I was introduced to the concept of somatic rituals through C.A. Conrad. And the way that these rituals developed in my own life, beyond just everyday mundane routines, was actually inspiration that I drew from professional hockey players. And I'm a big fan of hockey. It's my favorite sport to watch. And the thing about hockey games is that they're played all over the continent, which means they're happening in different time zones, possibly in the same week, which also means that the games won't be starting at the same time every day. And a way that a lot of these players manage that unpredictability, particularly of their environment, is by having game day rituals. And for them, it looks a lot like when they get up, going through the same hygiene routine, the same breakfast or meal before the game, depending on how early it is in the day, and then following the same pattern during their warm-ups and leading up to the time that the puck drops. And this inspired me a lot because I, like Contreras, have complex PTSD. And this makes it difficult to get into a creative space where I feel grounded in the present moment, because my body still struggles to identify when I'm actually safe. And what hockey players do is prepare their body to anticipate a specific environment by following this familiar pattern. And in a similar way to Contreras, it is a daily door they step through. So every time they go out on the ice, their body is prepared for it the same exact way. And this provides a sense of agency. Rather than being overwhelmed by the unpredictability of day-to-day life, there's a certain level of preparation and anticipation that somatic rituals offer us. So as a bit of an exercise, I wanted to demonstrate my own recent somatic ritual revision. And this is a braided lyric essay called Body of Proof. And I'll be walking you through my method for revising this essay. And if you'd like to participate in a similar exercise, feel free to pause any time or take your own notes and try it again at a different point. But what you'll want to do is first choose a work that you want to revise. And it can be any length and it can be any format. It doesn't have to be writing. It could be a photography project. It could be visual art that you've drawn that you feel could benefit from a revision. It could even be performance art or music. Anything that is a part of your creative practice that you'd like to revise. The second thing you'll do is identify the work's central focus or purpose. So this could be an emotional theme. It could be a particular critical lens. And it could be that the work you're engaged with offers you and your readers a specific outcome. Perhaps that's healing, perhaps that's asking a question, perhaps it's just the simple act of connecting with another human being. The third part is to select a sensory conduit. So if you consider what Rojas Contreras does, she wears an item of clothing that is a specific color, this muted ultramarine. And when she sits down to write, that's the color she puts on. And she calls it chromatic conditioning. And color is a really great sensory conduit for a lot of people because we not only have memories associated with color, but also emotions. So there's different routes to creativity through the use of color. So sensory conduits would include things like color, sound, texture, anything you can pick up and touch, pattern. So this could be a visual pattern, it could be a numerical pattern. I think it really is just based on what it is you're working with and what the purpose of that work is. Another sensory conduit would be scent. That is one of the strongest connections we have to memory and emotion. And if you'd like to use more than one sensory conduit, I highly encourage that. Maybe it's a mixture of sound and scent, and seeing how those creative associations or emotional ones manifest through the revision process for the work that you've selected. So once you've chosen this work, identified its central focus or purpose, and then selected one or more sensory conduits for the revision, what you'll do is engage in a revision process using those sensory conduits as a guiding structure. And I'll demonstrate how I did that as a way of giving you maybe some ideas. So, just as a bit of context for this essay, the central purpose is to examine the poetics of breaking the silence. So, having this experience of your reality silenced forcibly or through the use of gaslighting. The poetics of regaining agency from that silencing and emerging from institutional and or intimate abuse. And this is a braided lyric essay which has three main threads. The first thread is this short story by Charlotte Gilman called The Yellow Wallpaper. And if you're unfamiliar with the story of The Yellow Wallpaper, it is about a woman, an adult woman, who has recently given birth, and her husband moves them and their small household of helpers to the country to live in this house that they're renting. And the room that he decides unanimously for them to sleep in is an old nursery on the top floor of the house, and it is covered in this yellow wallpaper. And the story focuses around the way that the speaker, or the protagonist's husband, who is a doctor, systematically silences her and removes all avenues of agency. And the time this book was written, or the story was written, there was less of a common understanding of this, but it's clear now that the protagonist is suffering from postpartum depression. And her husband diagnoses her as having a nervous condition, similar to diagnosing people with hysteria. And in this rental home, as the speaker has all avenues of agency removed from her, she begins to fixate on the yellow wallpaper. And in doing so, she starts to develop all of these elaborate sensory rituals involving the wallpaper. During the night, she stays awake and just stares at the pattern of the wallpaper and begins to imagine in the moonlight all of these different shapes emerging from the pattern of the wallpaper, including what she believes is a woman trapped inside the wallpaper's pattern. And during the day, one of the ways that she reclaims a sense of agency over her environment is by physically peeling this offensive yellow wallpaper off of the walls. And the story ends with her completing that task, completing that ritual. And she's effectively removing this pattern of living in this house where her husband has systematically removed all avenues of agency. So the focus of this essay, Body of Proof, is how this type of systematic, institutional, and intimate abuse removes agency and places the burden of proof on the person who is the victim. And what I did to collect the other threads was try to consider how this analysis of the yellow wallpaper fits between what I sense or feel or experience emotionally and what I understand from a more pragmatic standpoint. So the second thread essentially has two parts. The first part of that thread is other stories that contain a similar emotional outcome as the yellow wallpaper. And those stories are Dirty River, In the Dream House, and then the poetry of Franny Choi in Soft Science. And for that second thread, I read all of these books and then I collected quotes from them that I felt resonated with the experience of the protagonist in the yellow wallpaper. And I cannot recommend these stories enough. And the other works of Leah Lakshmi Pyapsna Samarasena also recommend, particularly if you're interested in disability justice. The second part of the second thread is the more practical or pragmatic sources that we use, or that I use to understand the way that these sensory conduits become guiding structures for, in the case of the protagonist, a sense of release, and in the case of this essay, a method for revision. And those books are The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, Jane Allison's Meander, Spiral, Explode, Design and Pattern and Narrative, and The Secret Lives of Color by Kasia St. Clair. And so the second thread includes both emotional components and structural ones. So the way that our bodies interacting with sensory input bleeds into the way our emotions manifest in response to those sensory conduits. And then the third and final thread is poetry that I wrote to process my own experiences of this type of institutional and intimate abuse. And this is only one page of that poetry, and I will explain that in just a second. And here, if anyone is interested, is the works cited page for the whole essay. All the references to the pages and the quotes that I've used. So as you can see from this page, each of the threads has a different texture to it. And I chose this type of paper because I wanted it to reflect the act of peeling the wallpaper as being a ritual of shedding. So the protagonist in the yellow wallpaper is peeling the wallpaper through these sensory rituals as an act of shedding the constraints of her abuse and the removal of her agency. And this ritual becomes a form of release for her. And while I was engaged with this essay and with revising it, I had the idea to revise it by physically peeling the pages, the individual quotes, into strips of what looks like wallpaper. So the yellow and then this floral pattern are for the analysis of the yellow wallpaper. And then the quotes from the books that I showed you have these sort of happier floral patterns. And then for my own poetry, it has this striped pink and white pattern. And what I've done for revision, which you can see from this page here, is tactilely rearranging and reweaving all of these pieces into a cohesive narrative, into a cohesive analysis of this poetics of the burden of proof, the poetics of breaking the silence. So in your own exercise for revision, you can think back to the work that you've chosen and reflect, maybe even free write, about what you think the central focus is. What is really at the heart of this work for you? And for me, at the heart of this essay is that act of release, that act of regaining agency through these sensory rituals. And it's possibly less obvious with this version of the essay, but for my revision, the sensory conduits I used are color and texture. So I found the act of peeling all of these pieces of paper as if I was peeling the wallpaper very cathartic. It was definitely an act of release for me. And I could feel the way that it opened up my associative thinking. So the threads of these disparate sources started to click into place. I started to gain a stronger sense of the emotional and practical undercurrents of the threads that I was working with. So by focusing on colors that brought out these associations of experiences of having your agency removed, and by mimicking the protagonist's effort of peeling the wallpaper, that somatic ritual, this process of creating and revising this essay had the net effect of feeling as though I was the one shedding this old version of myself that felt trapped. So I hope that as you try this type of sensory somatic ritual, that you start to notice the ways that your memory and your intuitive associations are reinvigorated through these processes. And one of the things I love the most about incorporating somatic rituals into your creative practice is that you likely have your own somatic rituals already. And maybe it is the way that you wash dishes. Maybe it's the way that you walk your dog the same time every day. Maybe it's when you go for a hike. There are some beautiful trails in the state of Oregon, and the way that you notice the world around you and start to feel your body become a part of it. And I hope that as you continue this revision and as you go forward in your creative practice, that you think about the somatic input or the somatic routines that are already a part of your life, and maybe begin to imagine the ways that you could expand on those or really reside within them so that you become fully present in the moment, whether you're composing or revising, whether you're working in text or image, or if your art is more sonic or visual. I want to thank you for being a part of this session, and I want to end by recommending a few accounts that I follow. As someone who lives with chronic illness and PTSD, these are some folks who also process those aspects of their experiences through art and through creating and through the use of somatic rituals. So thank you so much, and I hope that you enjoy, and I hope that you find wealth and meaning in whatever somatic rituals you encounter.